Okay, so welcome everyone. We have got a nice meeting here today. I'm just going to get right into it with the introduction and updates and such, and then we'll pass it off to Krista, who's going to be doing the presentation today. So here's our agenda. As I mentioned, Krista Reeves is going to present on using water depth data from the continuous sensors. Note the meeting is being recorded. These recordings are presented at this website. There's all kinds of other resources there. Again, just reviewing that these meetings are taking place on the third Thursday of the month, 2:30 to 3:30 in the afternoon. Always the same Zoom link. Save that for your records if you care to. And please feel free to pass on, the meeting information to others. Let me know if you'd like any others that should be on the email distribution list. Happy to include it, other people that may be interested. Just to review, folks who are attending these meetings are working in the Delaware River Watershed Initiative or just in the Delaware Basin. And then we do have some folks from time to time attending from outside the Delaware Basin. The Stroud Center support to host these meetings and to provide support to groups using the EnviroDIY stations and support on any number of different monitoring efforts is provided via the Delaware River Watershed Initiative, which is a William Penn Foundation project. This is the overall website. The project, the DRWI, is much bigger than just this EnviroDIY component, far bigger than just this EnviroDIY component. And then Stroud is also able to provide support to watershed groups in the Pennsylvania via the Consortium for Scientific Assistance to Watersheds, PADEP program. So these meetings are, as we know, just time for us to all meet and pose questions, talk about things. We do provide updates, technical updates and resource updates and such. We usually have a presentation. As I mentioned today, it's going to be from Krista. And we're just trying to, support watershed groups throughout the Delaware Basin and collecting good data and using it purposefully, goal-oriented data use in their own local situations. Here's the immediate team involved: myself, Rachel, Krista, and Shannon. And then watershed stewards, Carol and George. And the DRWI leads at the Stroud Center, John, Matt, and Dave. Our primary goal from the Stroud Center perspective is to host meetings like this, do whatever we can do collaboratively to support watershed groups in using monitoring data for their own local purposes. Secondarily, we are internally analyzing data and developing tools to help groups do that. So I'm just going to go right into updates here. I mentioned the guidance materials, recordings, so on and so forth are at this website. You can go to Wiki Watershed and just click this DRWI tab, or just go straight to this website. And there's a lot of different resources here. If you have not fully investigated this website, I encourage you to do so. Update on the field visit data form. I've mentioned this in the last meeting or two, but just to mention it again, at this website, there's a new tab that you can click to enter your field visit data. These tabs are there then to actually check the spreadsheets where these data are stored. So there. Certainly encouraging people anytime you visit a site to fill out a data sheet. The blank data sheets are at this location. Fill out a form, hard copy, and then enter it into the electronic form, or just enter it directly into the electronic form if you care to. There's also a new submit for a service request button. This is if you need direct assistance on a station, on EnviroDIY station. If you're having, technical issues, you can feel free to request service via that button. It is a simpler form than what used to be there. It just requires a small bit of information to request assistance, and then there's optional items to that you can fill out if you are able. Again, mentioning these snapshots, plenty of folks are doing these salt snapshots. A few folks are going to be doing water temperature snapshots this summer. The Stroud Center is available to help with at any number of different levels there, from direct facilitation or just a quick call to sort of get you on your way with doing this type of work, or any number of other different potential monitoring approaches. So feel free to be in touch if you have ideas or wanting to go in a certain direction with your monitoring work or the application of your data. Also, just quickly wanted to mention, if you want to, please feel free to share photos or your stories of what's going on, and the communications folks at the Stroud Center are happy to share that to amplify whatever messages you may be trying to reach your audiences with. Just mentioning again, this happened last month. Tally, who was in the meeting today, hosted this putting water quality data to work locally at Conversation Cafe. She hosted this cafe here back in May, but it was recorded, and Callie can provide that to you if you'd like to view that. Tech updates. So Shannon, please feel free to chime in here. I'm going to pause after I go through these just to see if anyone has any questions. But Shannon just informed us that all of the tech supplies have been restocked. They are available at the EnviroDIY.org shop and at Amazon. Some of these items are only available in the shop and not on Amazon. But this list includes the EnviroDIY monitoring station kits. Those are the full kits that include everything except the sensor for building a station. The Mayfly or the LTE EnviroDIY cell boards are available. The Mayfly data loggers, the small kind of educational EnviroDIY starter kits, which are the Mayfly and a few Grove cables, a few tester sensors. The Wi-Fi boards are available, the Grove headphone jacks and jack boards, and the screw terminal boards are all available now. Any questions on that for Shannon before we move on?
Yeah, I have a quick one. I know some of us have the Yosemite turbidity sensors, and I was wondering if there was any more of the, I don't even know what they're called, honestly. The boards, the 4 screw boards are available for interface from those sensors to the boards.
No, what you need for that is the Modbus RS485 adapter, and those are not on that list there because we haven't finalized the design, and we'll have to get those manufactured and tested and all that. So that's why they're not on the list, but all the standard supplies for the CTDs, and if anybody does happen to be using either the old ClariView, or excuse me, the old OBS3 turbidity sensors or the new ClariView sensors, they'll work fine. But anything requiring a Modbus or other interesting interface type things, we're going to have to continue our development on those.
Okay. Any other questions about the tech supplies here? Okay. So just wanted to note here, our plan for the next, for the rest of the year really with these meetings. So Krista is today. As I mentioned, July 20th is going to be updates and progress in a full presentation from the local policy and practice work group. Ian Brastow, Dave Manning, and Steve Tricarico are going to be kind of working on that between now and July, and they'll have an update, a more comprehensive update on, all of the guidance materials and stuff that's been going on with the local policy and practice work group. We're still looking for someone to present in the August meeting. I know Jim Moore, who I don't know if Jim's here today, had proposed that Megan Fork could maybe do a presentation that month. Megan, I saw you came in. I'm not going to ask you to chime in because I don't want to I don't know if this is taking you by surprise or not, but I know a lot of groups have been working with Megan on a number of different things. Megan's working out there at Great Marsh with Jim, as well as doing a lot of interesting stuff in Westchester Borough. So, but feel free to get in touch with me if you have a idea for a presentation in August or a presentation in November. That's also an open spot for a presentation by a group or set of groups to do a collaborative presentation on whatever topic may seem appropriate or interesting. We're going to talk about salt again in September. John's going to do a comprehensive science of salt presentation, and then I'll do a monitoring type presentation in October, kind of the same format as we use for temperature, with the science 1 month and then the monitoring the next month. And then December will be kind of a review, end of year summary and such. And we're going to do that December 14th instead of 21, so that it's more accessible in terms of vacationing and all. Okay, I see there's something in the chat. Okay. Megan's going to give it some thought. Thanks, Megan. Jim said he was going to chat with you, but I guess that didn't happen yet. All right, and no worries. Okay, moving on. I'll pass it off to Ian quickly to go through some quick updates. And Ian, just I'll just scroll through the slides. Just tell me when to advance.
Yep, sounds good. All right, so this is the I don't know, third or fourth time we've gone through this at this point. Not much has changed with the leadership group, except for Steve, who has joined us and has been a very active member. So I want to specifically shout out to him and thank him for the work that he's been doing. So thank you, Steve, for that. Aside from that, we meet the first Thursdays of every month at 11 a.m. with a recurring Zoom link. Feel free to go on to the next slide. So with a part of this, one of our first charges was to create a short-term charge to really guide the direction of our group. We've settled on this as our short-term charge. It has been serving us very well in the creation of some documents, which I will talk a little bit about in the next slide. So we are in the process of creating 4 guidance documents for temperature, depth, conductivity, and turbidity, and then a 5th document which provides a overall approach to how to go about seeking additional municipal involvement. So we have a little bit more information on the next slide. And this is a more organized list of what we've been working on recently. Specifically, we've chosen to focus on temperature first. We have the guidance document, which David Manning is helping prepare. and a one-pager, which Steve has been helping prepare. The guidance document is more for internal use for people who are trying to become versed in the science and how that science correlates and corresponds with some topic matters that might appeal to municipal governments and their agendas. We plan on creating a guidance document as well as a one-pager for conductivity, depth, and turbidity. So following that same structure, that may change depending on what we find with each of these documents. There may be more documents, maybe less, but for now, that is the general goal. The one-pager, rather than being an internal use document, is more for external use, something that you can give out to we call them ECs in New Jersey, but I believe PA calls them EACs. But this seems to be a very good way of broaching a lot of the subjects. It's a quick, digestible way of presenting information that is useful to spark conversation. Document 5, that'll be more of an intensive strategy on how to approach municipal leaders, guidance on how just sometimes maybe specific little things like confidence for public speaking, which I need to work on personally. But that is definitely something that is a big part of when you're trying to engage a municipal government or committee. It's good to be able to sound like you know what you're talking about, and we're going to be going in more depth with that on document 5. And as David mentioned earlier, we are planning to do a more in-depth covering of our progress and what the guidance documents actually look like in July's update. Hopefully we'll also have a outline for document 5, though that is going to be very much so reflected. It may change significantly as successive deliverables are being made. But with that, if there's any questions, feel free to send them my way. And if you want to join in on this, if you feel like you have something you want to add, feel free to send an email my way. David has my email and he can forward that to everyone else. And yeah, that's all we got.
I have a very short question. Ian, do you have a series of deadlines for actual presentation or a doing the initial pilot program, and where would you be doing that?
So we haven't discussed that in depth. We have discussed the potential of doing a pilot program. We want to really solidify these documents first so that it'd be an effective pilot program. But if you have any suggestions about good study areas or potential places that you think would benefit from having the pilot program happen there, I'm all ears. Feel free to send me an email. David just put that into the chat. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good thought, Grace. I mean, just in terms of starting to think about like, well, you know, Dave Manning and Steve are already working at their local level. So these documents, and that's how we sort of, that was kind of the vision for putting this group together, that the people involved would be people that would be self-serving for them, as well as for the broader audience, where they can use these products themselves in their own territories, in their own local context.
Do they have recording mechanisms for what David is doing? Do they have a GoPro? Do they, because many towns don't videotape? Anything?
Videotaping meetings, you mean?
Yeah, at the presentation, so that they can look at it afterward and that's how you evaluate. Or it's one means.
That's a good idea. If you want, we can set up a time to discuss after the meeting.
Sure. No,
and-
since it was brought up that David is working on a local level and, okay, great.
Yeah, and
Well,
maybe
happy with that.
Dave Manning, I don't know if you want to put your email in there, or Steve, if you want to, maybe you guys would be interested in talking. I mean, it's just another kind of interesting direction to go in with this, these products, where it's like, yeah, I mean, once we get to potentially piloting, presentations for municipalities, well, just like with these meetings, it would be nice to have a recording. Awesome. Thank you, Ian. Any other questions before we pass it off to Krista? Okay, I'm going to stop share. And Krista, you can take over if you're ready.
Thanks,
Oh,
Dave.
I didn't introduce Krista. I had a nice slide to introduce Krista. Oh, well. Krista is with the Musconetcong Watershed Association. She can tell her title, and she also supports the Stroud Center as a Northern Delaware Basin leader and technician.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, so, I've been to most of these meetings, and I am a Stroud employee. And, we've been talking about conductivity and temperature and all of the supplemental data that you can collect around these parameters and how to use your EnviroDIY most effectively. And something that came to mind, when we were talking in the early part of the year, was that we really haven't touched on depth a lot. And that struck me as a little odd. I mean, we talk about these CTD, sensors, right? That's 1/3 of what these sensors are doing. And so I kind of wanted to put together a little bit of data and, ways that the MWA is using that depth data to further monitoring, inform recreation, and then also compile other data, right? So that's what I'm going to touch on today, right? So the Musconetcong River, we're up here, right, in the northwest part of New Jersey. We are a wild and scenic river, which is a distinct, designation that gets us some funding, that gets us some management partners. And part of that is that we are part of the DRWI that ingratiates us with, this partnership that gives us some of this technology, right? And so part of what makes us a little different and odd is that it's a long and thin watershed, right? Most watersheds don't look like this. They mostly look like a bowl, right? So we're 46 miles long. We drain 156 square miles, and we have 2 independently managed headwater lakes, right? So our headwaters are up here, in the top of this cutout, basically. All these little feeder streams feed into a couple of very large man-made lakes, Lake Packong, the largest lake in New Jersey, and then right below that is Lake Musconetcong, right? And so you would think being, one of those largest lakes would give you some funding, but there's one USGS station that basically monitors the water coming out of the lake, right? And then there's also just one USGS station on the entire river that calculates flow, right? And that's great to have, but that doesn't mean a whole lot when you're looking at separate parts of this river, right? And so I've kind of put here, right, we've got one USGS station here at the outflow of Lake Pakong, and that just basically tells us what's coming out of the lake. That doesn't tells us actually what's in the river, because there's other inputs and other losing streams, you know, and outflows and inflows, right? Other effluents coming in. So I've kind of tagged things as they come along, but here only on the main stem, right? Like we have other stations that are on tributaries, but I've only flagged things that are on the main stem, right? So here's the outflow of Lake Pakong. And then below, about 1 mile below Lake Musconetcong, we have an EnviroDIY station. And then one in the more urban areas we have is in Hackettstown here. And then we have a long stretch here where we don't have any monitoring as far as continuous sensors are concerned. And then we come up to Hampton here, and we have an EnviroDIY. And then here right above Bloomsbury, we have a USGS station, right? And so this is a benchmark for us. We do use this in the creation of a lot of data and a lot of monitoring. And then 3 below that, because we have a lot of dams, we have a lot of impediments to movement for Andromedas, and Catadromus migratory fish, and we're in the process of removing some of these dams and monitoring for them. And so we kind of need to know exact flow at those points, right? So, you know, the USGS gauge and supplemental data, you know, that goes along with it is great, right? The USGS gauge gives us historical data going back over 100 years, but that means there's only one point of measurement that's an actual point of measurement for flow on the Musconetcong River, right? And that doesn't mean a whole lot when you're working up in Hackettstown or, you know, far below it near Regalsville, you know, boat launch, you know, near the mouth of the river, right? So, and we have several dams and inputs both above and below those points, and need to understand flow at both of those regions. So I kind of put this here because every single time we go out to one of these sites, we're taking a flow meter with us and we're gauging it, right? So here we have the summer of 2021 where we did a lot of monitoring work. And so every time we went out, we would look up, right, what the Bloomsbury gauge, that USGS gauge, had to say, right? And then we would get our actual, right, either from our measurements and or from the EnviroDIY in that rating curve, and then understand the difference and the percent difference, right? Because we're trying to understand loading and flow. So our best methods for us is to understand against USGS, right? Like they're pretty much the benchmark for understanding flow in our river. So we literally took our equipment, put it right on top of USGS's station and measured against what they had. You know, we use an MF Pro. I know some of you don't have access to that, but, you know, use the DRWI, use those partnerships, use the equipment loan program that EPA has, you know, get some of those, you know, really high level equipment to you so that you can understand the flow in your area, right? I mean, I understand that the float method is out there. You know, I've used that. I've stacked that up against, you know, using professional equipment. It's somewhat comparable, but it's not going to get you as accurate and precise as you need if you're like trying to understand loading in your river, right? And so after you've determined placement of your sensors, which is a big part of it, Stroud's going to help you with that, right? Understanding at your highest peak flow levels and at your most base flow levels, right, at drought conditions, which a lot of us are in right now, where your sensors are going to be best placed. And, you know, wait for a little while after those are installed, right? Like give it, you know, 6 months before you start creating some, you know, these rating curves. before, because you don't want to have to go moving it. And then, a lot of your work has been lost at that point, right? So after you know that your sensor has been put in the right spot, start creating these rating curves as soon as possible. And the more data, the better, right? Highest flows that you can absolutely get out there, under high flow conditions and still be safe. Those are good. And then, get all of those in between, get every single flow condition. Every time you go out, right? A lot of us will put supplemental data out there, right? We're looking with a Hanometer or a YSI to QC that conductivity or QC that temperature. But the same thing is also, good to do for your depth, right? You're doing the measurement for depth with a meter stick, but discharge, if you have a USGS station on your river at any point, is good to understand, right? QA, QC yourself with that USGS station, right? So there's a few ways that we use this depth data, right? So one is an outreach tool. We have lots of recreation on this river, right? That's part of the wild and scenic designation is that it is for people to come and recreate, right? We have kayakers, canoers, tubers, anglers. That's me, catching trout, right? We want people to use these rivers in a responsible and safe way. And so what we do is on top of, our stations, right? This is a cutout of what we put on our stations. Okay. I know that there's no shock hazard, but we put that so people don't go messing with them. I mean, a little bit of hyperbole is a good thing, right? But what this actually gives people is a reason to not mess with the stations. This is a reason for people to go, oh, okay, let me pull out my phone. I'm going to QC this, and I'm going to look at this, QR code, and I'm just going to understand what's out there. And we have a lot of involvement with Trout Unlimited, with local kayaking clubs in the area, and they're starting to understand the flow in their areas. I put out many articles in our own, month, or not monthly, but quarterly updates to our subscribers, and I tell them how to use this data. We put this in our monthly in-stream updates, how to use this data. And so it's educating the public on, they can know before they go, right? Like, there is a lot of money tied up into angling, right? Like, if anybody has been involved in fishing, they know how much time and resources goes into setting up a fishing trip sometimes, right? Like, if you're getting ready to go out with your buddies for the weekend and you don't even know if conditions are right, like, it's a gamble. But if you can actually just look these things up, then problem solved, right? Like, we know that we can wade in, and that the riffles are going to be right, that the trout riffle and run situation is going to be just right. And so, or if a kayaker, like, wants to go in and they don't know if they're going to have to portage over an entire mile section of stream, they can look it up, they can come to our website, and they can start to understand what these measurements mean, because 321 millimeters doesn't mean anything, right? Like, that doesn't really mean a whole lot to the average person. But if they start understanding and communicating with us and getting involved, they can see what those measurements mean. And so this also, like, is informative to our monitoring. Here at the MWA, we do a lot of data gathering and involved monitoring, right? So we do a lot of electroshocking, and we have recently gotten into environmental DNA gathering, right? So knowing the flow at each site informs us the day of, because these things are so touchy, like, looking at this amount of, input that it takes from people to get out there with equipment and time to go in and electroshock a river. it's thousands and thousands of dollars on the line each time you go out to monitor a site. And if the conditions aren't right, you've just wasted everybody's day, or at least morning, let's put it that way, and thousands of dollars, right? You know, we need to know, is a barge right for this situation, or is it just a bunch of backpacks at this point? For environmental DNA, we need to know, are we actually able to wade across this entire river at this point so that we can gather all 3 points of data, you know, bank, and middle, right? That's what we're looking for when we gather environmental DNA. We need to know if we can get all 3 points of data. And so we can look at these sensors, understand the flow at that point, and then get in the river to, you know, collect these data. We have also done a lot of microbial source tracking and E. coli work in our river. We have a TMDL for most of the river to reduce E. coli inputs. And so what you're really looking at here in this slide is subbasins and their loading, right? So anything that's red or pink, it means that loading in that area of E. coli has increased. Anything that is green has decreased. We use these sensors and taking discharge to understand these loads, right? And then calculate that, right? So we work with Montclair State University with this project for 2018 and 2021. And so we have several, you know, strategically placed sensors that we've gone and created, you know, these rating curves for, so that we understand and can calculate load, right? They come up with a percentage, right? They go into the lab and they say, okay, from this sample, we know that we have certain amount of colony forming units. Well, what does that mean in terms of how much volume of water is actually in the river at that point, right? So it's upon us at the MWA as their partner to come up with the volume of water. So we either use the discharge calculated on the spot and or the, you know, discharge calculated by the EnviroDIYs that we've cultivated over many seasons with rating curves. And then circling this all back, you know, we are now contributing data back to the USGS, right? They only have one station that accurately calculates flow on our river. And they're coming to do a large study this summer on our river in the middle part of the Musconetcong. And they need to understand when and where is a good time to put in our kayaks for these flotillas, right? They're putting a whole bunch of sensors on the backs of kayaks and they're floating them down the river to understand pH, groundwater inputs, you know, and so we need to be able to tell them when and where is good points to put these sensors in, right? So we've come up with these calculated flows and rating curves based on where we have sensors, where's a good point, you know, understanding our river. And so we calculated again against not only just the sensors, but the USGS gauge, right? So it's a side-by-side calculation, basically. You know, you're taking what's happening at the Bloomsbury gauge, you know, that's what BB means, CFS, and then what's the flow on site, or what does the sensor say from its rating curve? And then we come up with knowing that site, where is it passable? When is it too low? When is a high flow for watercraft? When would they, you know, come in to culverts or bridges at a dangerous level? Because they need to understand, you know, once they put these kayaks in, where they're floating to is going to be safe passage from them based on our calculations. So it's not just us internally understanding flow. This is a feedback loop back to USGS. You know, I just wanted to put this together to talk about depth a lot. I know that we don't talk about it. We talk about conductivity and temperature a lot. So I really welcome a conversation around this and trying to understand how you can better use it in your, you know, situations. So thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Krista. Very informative.
Terrific.
Questions for Krista?
How easy is it to produce a cross section to create that flow rate? That flow rate. I don't know. Factor.
Yeah, the
Um,
discharge. Yeah. So,
yeah.
I mean, as long as it's waitable, we've done this on the low pat at several points. We do it for the DRWI when we're collecting all the samples there so that we can do the same thing, right? Like understand loading. So it's, as long as it's waitable, it's not an impediment as long as you have the equipment. And that's why I really stress, like, reach out, right? The DRWI is the whole point. Like,
Right.
borrow equipment from your friends, like ask your partners, like have them come and help you, or loan you equipment. Like I've loaned out HAB meters to Lake Apacong Foundation for 2 years now. I pretty much think they own like one of my meters at this point. So, it's fair to say, like, we have 2 discharge meters, those 2 MF Pros, and we would be happy to help other, organizations like build these rating curves, because it's so important in many different ways. Like informing recreation, like I said, but informing monitoring also, like that you're going to go out and do, and creating some of these loading curves and equations. So
The reason why I brought that up is because a little while ago there was Aqua and Jay was putting in a line right underneath that low pat sensor, and I really wanted to get a good sense of what the disturbance was, because there's also regulations that change depending on how much is being diverted, and I didn't have any accurate data for that particular point, so I wasn't able to really.
WA has a lot of that information, Ian.
You do?
Yeah, because we do
Okay.
monitor the low pat.
Yeah.
So we do have a lot of discharge data
Okay.
and rating curve information that I can get to you. Sure.
That's great. Thank you.
Dave, I see your hands up.
Right. So I was interested, not so much in discharge as in velocity. And to get to discharge, you have to relate depth to velocity as well. Have you done any studies, or can you use this kind of information to examine migration of aquatic organisms? I'm thinking in terms of fish.
Yep.
Obstacles, and not too related to that, but also erosion control.
Yep. So we've done a 5-year study in cooperation with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and part of that has been fish migration. I mean, obviously, U.S. Fish and Wildlife is very concerned about migratory fish. So one of the biggest concerns on the Musconetcong has been the return of the American shad. And so every time we go out and we electroshock or do eDNA, part of that understanding of discharge is velocity, right? So understanding where they might actually be. And that's part of that understanding of collecting the eDNA, right? So where would they naturally pool? Where might a juvenile shad hang out after the adults have left the system? And so that's part of the calculation, and part of the understanding is the velocity and where to collect these samples, right? So eDNA is still, I know it's moving up in its technology, but it's still somewhat in its infancy as a use. But right now, NJDEP has said that for best practices, you take 3 samples on a river of the size of the Musconetcong. So that means 2 banks about 6 feet out, and then the thowwag, right? So we're looking at velocity to understand where the thowwag actually is, where that lies. It's not just always the middle. And so we're trying to understand bank, and then the thowwag to take those eDNA samples. And part of that is taking lots and lots of discharge measurements and pairing that up to the EnviroDIY to understand discharges, and then when is key times to go out there and sample for things like that. I mean, American eel is also another concern for us. It's another migratory fish that U.S. Fish and Wildlife is very concerned about, but they're a little more wily than the American shad. They're like a snake, they'll very little water, they'll move up systems, whereas the shad won't. And so that's been our target species as far as some of this monitoring.
Can you just talk to your E. coli measurement?
Yeah, absolutely. I know that that's a very big concern for you, Grace, up there. So, we've done a lot of work. We have a TMDL on the river that says that we need to reduce E. coli and or fecal coliform, which they're not the same, on our river by 93%, right? So we need to be able to quantify that. So we need to be able to constantly quantify the volume of water that's moving past a certain point if we do any kind of microbial source tracking and or E. coli measurements. And so what we do is that every single time we go out there and take a measurement for E. coli, we take discharge, or we have it related back with a very rigorous rating curve to an EnviroDIY station, and that will give us loads, right? So we need to understand load calculations because that's the language that DEP speaks, right? They only speak in loads, and so you need to understand how much water is moving past a point when you take a sample for CFUs for E. coli to understand how much would be in that volume of water at a certain point in time. So if you are looking to do that on the Neversink and tributaries too, you need to understand your discharge and volume of water going past those stations, but it needs to be rigorous, or have a QAP, right? You need a quality assurance project plan. I don't know if New York has something like that for continuous data. New Jersey just kind of put that on the books lately. And so I'm scrambling to update, all of our language and put that into a quality assurance project plan so that our sensors are also part of that, and so that we can use them in quantifying volumes and other measurements as well. But that's one of our biggest focuses is on the amount of bacteria in the water. So if you want to talk about that more offline, Grace, I'd be happy to.
Great, I was about to say that. And the sensors for that are that you can build them into the our monitoring sensors that are there?
Well, depth is already there, right? That's part of the CTD, right? That's the D and then the CTD, that's depth. But you need to be able to pair that with discharge in a rigorous, like I was saying, you need to have a really robust rating curve at the very high R-squared value. I'm looking,
which we do not have. Okay, right.
Yeah. So I would look for something like 95% and above on an R-squared for depth to discharge for supplemental data. But once you have it, you don't need to be out there. That's why I'm saying borrow some equipment and get out there for an entire season, spring to fall, and get these high and low flows for your sensor so that you can understand, so that into the future, right? Just like conductivity to chloride, you don't need to be out there constantly doing chloride. Once you create this like really robust rating curve, you've got it, and if you have high confidence in it with a high R-squared, then, you can move forward with other parts of your monitoring work, like understanding loading.
We have had, we've been doing our focus model testing, and it's been all over the place from 1,300 parts per million down to 85. But all
that could be, yeah.
And but it's still happening. We have a new station that we're going to be putting in And I'll talk to you. It's at the lower part of the Neversink, and it has been scoured by the floods. So one hill is about 35 feet high with all the vegetation scraped off it from both the winter and huge ice flows, some that are like 20 feet
Right.
tall. And the other side is not enough to put in a sensor. It's very shallow and almost very beach-like. So this is a very area that hasn't really been explored on the lower Neversink. So
Yeah.
we'll have.
I mean, if you're looking to do bacteria work, I would absolutely suggest like creating a really robust rating curve for, you know, depth to discharge, and understanding like your volume, as it moves through the seasons, because, you know, that's key, right? Like you can have like a sample that says 12,000 CFUs, but when you don't put that into context, it doesn't really matter, right?
Right.
Like if you don't understand, like are we talking about a creek that I can jump across, or are we talking about a river that I need a boat for, right? Like that doesn't really matter, like what you're
Or
talking.
in portage.
Yeah, it's
yeah.
very important
It's
to understand. So
all
yeah,
right.
I mean, we can talk about that further.
Definitely.
I've been up to those sites, you know, like I helped set up 3 of them. And so like we can talk about further quantifying and taking supplemental data at this point. So
And I just made contact with the USGS right over in Milford. And they were doing work right on the Neversink, right down in Godefroy next to us. So good, thank you.
isn't there a USGS station on that trip? There was.
No, it's right where the big station is called the Godefroy Station.
Okay.
And it's I would say it's a third of a mile or half a mile
All right.
below where the
After the confluence.
Yeah.
Okay.
right below where
Yeah.
the camp.
Yeah. I mean, that's how like the Musconetcong is. Like one would think there's 3 USGS stations the way they're labeled, but in reality, there's only one in the lower middle section that is actually measuring the flow of the main stem. And so you need to be careful with that too, right? Like we have one in the upper watershed, but it is only measuring what is coming out of Lake Pacong. Like it's not measuring anything other than the outflow of that lake. And so it's not actually measuring what's inside of the system. And then we have a station that is in the Delaware measuring the confluence of the Musconetcong and the Delaware. So it's not representative of what's actually happening inside of the Musconetcong as a system. And so that's why, you know, it's good to have these auxiliary measurements and then match them up against, if you do have a USGS station, like that's the best thing. That's the best possible scenario, right?
Well, they moved
So-
one right off the and moved it about 4 miles away because in storms, the Neversink River would back up into the lower
Right.
Abashik Hill, so that we have Stroud helped us. The team came up and we relocated it into the Bashik Hill itself.
Yeah, right.
So
Okay.
great, thanks.
Okay, Carol.
Hi, Krista. Thank you. That's really interesting talk, bringing together a lot of parameters. Very interesting. Could you just say a little bit more about eDNA? Is it being used to identify presence of different fish, aquatic species, but can it actually give you some measure of the relative density, so to speak, or
that's
concentration of different species?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. So at present, that's something they're working on. We are focused on presence absence of American shad in the system, but that's via, you know, our cooperative agreement with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. However, I know that they are working on techniques right now. It's called metabarcoding, and we're also having that done. I don't have the data back yet. I'm still waiting on that. But what I'm being told is that they're starting to be able to understand relative densities, right, via these measurements, right? So meaning, you collect a liter of water, and if you understand the volume of water that's passing through there, then you can understand the density of the detections, right? So if you have like, let's just say bluegill, perch, bass, like smallmouth bass, trout, marginated mantoms, all of these species show up. But how much of their DNA is actually showing up in that sample, then they're going to be able to start quantifying how much, but like I said, you take 3 samples per site, right? So every single site, you're taking bank, in the middle, or the thalweg, whichever happens to, be the most high flow. And so they're concatenating that data, putting that all together and trying to understand what's real and what's not, because some of that, cannot be real. They're trying to understand at this point, is there actually an elephant in the river? If they're picking up certain DNA, I use that as just a, sanity test, right? Like, we do insane amount of, cleaning in between sites. Like, we're spraying ourselves down with bleach, basically, each, between each site. We have what's called clean hands, dirty hands. It takes 2 people, one person that touches things and the one person that doesn't touch anything, and that's collecting samples. So, we're working with DEP and the labs that are doing these analyses as they move forward, to try and understand that better, because I would love nothing more than to be able to quantify. We did our DNA last year alongside of electroshocking at one point, so that we could pair that data, right? So whatever came up in the electroshocking, when it came up in eDNA, try to understand those 2 things side by side, because it's still very young in its technology. So.
And what's the relationship between the deepest, fastest current, the thalweg, and the banks? What's the DNA?
Right. Yeah. So some fish are actually looking for that refuge, right? They're looking for the banks. Especially American shad, once they spawn, and they have juveniles in the system, they create these bait balls, right? So it's very small fish in schools, basically, right? So schools of fish, and they're looking for those more shallow areas that they can pool together, feed, because they're not eating anything other than just, primary producers at that point. And so you're looking for a mix of that habitat so that you can then understand, right? Like, if you're having all of your hits for presence absence on your banks, you usually know then, like, also with paired with the time of year, that it could be juveniles. If it's all in the thalweg, maybe those are adults moving up, right? Like, they're migrating. So there is a touch of, like, nuance there. I'm not saying that any of the data that we have is conclusive. I'm first to say that this is all kind of, first flush. So.
And I'm sorry, just one more question.
Sure.
I thought that there were multiple studies that showed that the concentration of E. coli would increase at the first flush of a storm, that kind
Absolutely.
of it gets flushed. So is that
Nope,
is
that's totally true. That's true. And that's something you want to know, right? Like, you have sensors there. You don't have to actually go out and measure those things. Like, when the rain, like, you're getting the rain report, right? You get the weather report and you think, oh, well, thunderstorms are in the area, but you're actually seeing that reflected inside of the sensors. And then you can quantify that and understand, because there are a certain amount of our samples that we need to be those first flush, rain samples. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I am going to stop recording because we are past 3:30. And if anyone wants to stay on to chat, they can. So stopping recording.